Now, Indian democracy has had one major and I think grossly underestimated success, and that is in ensuring that whatever happens to the market, however unfair the market is, the people can be protected from its worst effects. That you can call it subsidies, you can call it welfare, you can give it whatever name you like. But if you have not had large scale starvation as a result of the movement from agriculture to industry, it is essentially because you have had systems to take care of the poorest.
This significant Indian achievement notwithstanding, India's rural crisis never seems to end. Listen to Narendar Pani talk to Anusha Ravi Sood on BIC Talks.
Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. This episode is about the rural crisis that Indians like to forget. Much as we repeatedly forget this crisis, as we record this episode on December 8th, protesting farmers from across the country are loudly reminding us that the crisis is very real and affects the lives of hundreds of millions of Indians. Professor Narendar Pani from the National Institute of Advanced Studies, NIAS, Bangalore, joins us today to tell us more. Dr. Pani, welcome to BIC Talks.
Thank you for having me.
Talking to Dr. Pani is Anusha Ravi Sood, Assistant Editor at the New Indian Express. Welcome, Anusha, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pavan. Quite a bit of a topic, quite heady and heavy, especially at a time when farmers from our wheat heartland are reminding India that attention is required and immediate attention is required, not just to agriculture, but to the rural crisis. For an agrarian economy, Professor Pani, how seriously do we take our rural areas? How seriously do we take our rural economy?
It has for a long time been out of the purview of most policy making. This is a tradition that goes back to the second plan when you had a very detailed structure for industry, but it was assumed that agriculture would take care of itself with perhaps a little land reform. That did not happen, and then you had the crisis of 1965, which caused the Green Revolution. But soon after that, I think everyone just went back to completely ignoring agriculture.
Just to give us an overview of everything that constitutes rural economy, because sitting in Indian cities, there is very little time that we spend thinking about our farmers. And we forget that rural economy is not just about farmers. There are also about landless peasants. It is also about women farmers. It is about inheritance laws. It's so many things. Agrarian economy, or rather the rural distress in India, is about a whole lot of things. Just if you could just take us through the most important aspects to remember when we are discussing agrarian crisis or rural crisis in India.
I think we need to recognize that at the heart of the rural economy still is agriculture. It's not that agriculture is, in a production sense alone, at the core of the rural economy. In fact, agriculture share in GDP has been dropping consistently, quite rapidly, and is now just around 15%. But the difficulty is that people are not leaving agriculture as rapidly as the decline in output. So you still have about at least 40 to 50% of your population directly involved in agriculture. And if you include those who are indirectly involved in terms of support services, it's much larger. So you're really dealing with agriculture as the core. And then the relationship with agriculture is a good way to see everyone else, whether it is in terms of women, in terms of agricultural labor, peasants, large landowners, whoever we want to look at. It is best to start with in terms of the relationship with agriculture.
Every year when there is drought or when there is flood, all of these natural disasters, natural calamities, although it impacts everybody, the impact on agriculture is long lasting, at least for that 1 year. There is this argument that a lot of urban people come up with, the urban, intelligent, educated persons come up with, and asking why so many subsidies are given to agriculture, to farmers. Why are there so many discounts that are given to them, right from input costs to and support price when their produce is finally in the mandis. So if you could just take us through the pressures in agriculture. We speak about how the government doles out subsidies to the farmers. We never speak about the pressures that exist on farmers or agricultures, whether it is land owning farmers, whether it is the landless farmers. What about the women farmers who do not feature in the entire ownership deal of agricultural farms?
Well, I think essentially what we need to see in this whole process is that your agriculture has a land constraint. So you cannot grow rapidly, or at least at the pace that say an IT industry or other service sectors can grow. Right? So when you're dealing with it, you necessarily are constrained, and across the world, because you need the food that agriculture provides, agriculture is heavily subsidized. Right? It's a necessity due to the simple fact that the sector cannot grow as rapidly. At the same time, it is an essential sector that cannot be brushed aside. The problem is made more difficult in India by the fact of inheritance laws, which divide the land equally among all members of the family. So from generation to generations, the farms get smaller and less viable. At the same time, there are farmers who benefit from the uncertainties in agriculture, just as others lose out in that same process. So as a result of which, you get some farmers, there's a differentiation in the peasantry, and some farmers become even smaller. The third factor that affects them is that you do not have non-agricultural options available to them. There are a few, but certainly not enough to absorb the entire farming community that wants to leave agriculture. I know there is a difference between the large farmer and the agricultural labor, and this is a part of the discourse for many years. But it's important that this difference is not as much in terms of the dynamics of the process. If the large farmer gets affected, so does the agricultural labor. The effect on the agricultural labor is much more, undoubtedly. But the processes that affect them are very often the same. So I think the main thing that you need to recognize is that there is an overall pressure. Some of that pressure is largely sort of inherent in farming as opposed to the rapid growth of other sectors. But a large part of the pressure is also because of the unviability of the small farms that dominate Indian agriculture.
You take a look at all these farmers protesting on the outskirts of Delhi, a huge chunk of them from Punjab, many farmers, thousands of them from Haryana. A lot of these farmers are either small and marginal farmers or farm laborers, because they believe that the new farm bills probably have not considered their long-term welfare when it comes out. Do you look at this as an outburst, as a result of the pressures in responding to the challenges when it comes to agriculture, whether it is economy-wise, whether it is crop-wise, or whether it is individualistic challenges that they face in agriculture? And what really is the way to step up, investments in agriculture, or probably step up modernization or techniques in agriculture?
The current crisis is largely the result of the Green Revolution strategy, which is why it's affecting primarily the Green Revolution states of Punjab, Haryana, and Western Uttar Pradesh. The point about that strategy was it occurred when India was close to a famine in the mid-60s. And the idea was that the farmers couldn't take any risk whatsoever. So the credit was given, particularly after the 70s, through the nationalized banks. New technology was provided, so the credit could be used to buy those seeds or make other investments in agriculture. The increased output was procured. It was a guaranteed procurement of rice and wheat. As a result of that procurement, you had a surplus generated or sort of procured by the government, which could be used to create a public distribution system. Now, this process has now been threatened by the farm bills, right? It's not that the government says, no, we have no problems with continuing with the minimum support price. But the moment you take the mandis, which is where the procurement took place, you take the mandis out of the picture or you weaken the mandis, the farmer is no longer guaranteed of his product being sold. And that is a major problem because in what happens in Indian agriculture, if you look at crops, is they tend to move in cycles. Typically, when somebody is growing something and seems to look good, prices are high, everybody runs into that same crop. And as they grow that crop, you get a surplus production, the prices by the time the crops come out crash. Right? So the mandis provide a mental sort of safeguard against that, in the sense that there's a guaranteed procurement there at a government fixed procurement price. The moment you say you have to sell to the private sector, then a part of the product will go there, and the mandi's commitment to buy everything that comes to them breaks down. Right? In fact, you will have very little attention there. So people keep telling you there's nothing in the law that says that we will against the mandis. The mandis will continue. But the mandis will become unviable the moment the private sector enters the picture. And the private sector has no commitment, should not have a commitment because they function on economic terms. In economic terms, there's no case you can make for them to buy food or food grain at a minimum support price when they can get it cheaper. So this basic process is something that is being ignored by the official circles. And that is the heart of the problem.
We do see an example of Bihar. They brought in these changes, say about 15 years ago, and the results perhaps have not been as they anticipated out of this.
Yes, but you see, Bihar had the additional problem. They didn't have any industries. So their workers come to places like Bangalore or any other major city. Now, you might say Bihar was always a backward agriculture. It was not one of the major beneficiaries of the Green Revolution. But nevertheless, you shouldn't underestimate the potential for a successful state to decline. Bengal was a leading industrial state not so long ago. Today, their workers are also forced to come alongside Biharis and people from Jharkhand to find work in the southern and western states. So there is a crisis, and that fear is very real. And I think that's that fear that is driving the agitation in Delhi.
There's one more aspect, I think, of agriculture that we seldom forget. In my visits to especially coastal areas, say, for example, Uttar Kannada during elections and all of that, irrigation has been a topic that has actually catapulted leaders to political significance in states like Karnataka. Former Prime Minister H.D. Deve Gowda became a farmer's leader because of his heavy investments, heavy approvals of agricultural projects in Karnataka. Irrigational projects in Karnataka. But years down the line, we speak so much about agriculture. We speak so much about the importance of ensuring that agriculture's contribution to the GDP remains same. But we have such huge lakhs and lakhs and hectares of dry land. We have no irrigation in many, many lands. For example, like I said, in Uttar Kannada, the farmers there can grow only one crop in a year because of acute shortage of water and irrigation projects. Are we leaving out, if one were to consider, given the kind of budgetary allocations to agriculture, are we concentrating more on subsidies but not so much on infrastructure investments in ensuring higher agricultural output?
See, you must remember that irrigation is possible when there's water available, right? And that is a natural resource. And Karnataka is actually a very arid state. So the water available is very limited. Politicians cannot say so because they have used it in the past and they would like to continue using it. So they tend to exaggerate the amount of water available. They push for projects that are intrinsically not viable. You need to develop a technology for dryland agriculture, as is done in many parts of the world. The basic difference being that in irrigated agriculture, you take water to the crop. In dryland agriculture, you essentially make sure the crop or the land makes the best use of water that comes to it. Now, this process requires large, contour building, contour bunding, various such elements around the process, which cuts across the land of many farmers. Now, it works in many parts of the world because you have very large farms. So there's no distinction between the land that the farmers own and the area that's required for contour bunding to get the benefit of dryland, sort of the water that comes to drylands. But in India, that's not the case. You have a very large number of small farmers. And they are not going to invest in contour bunding and other large-scale dryland farming technologies when they don't see a benefit in it for them directly. Right? It will be a long-term benefit in terms of the improvement of the soil and what goes with it. And that is a crisis. How do you handle that? How do you manage that?
Even now, to urban city dwelling Indians, we think of a village and all we can think of is hectares and hectares of green patches of land and crops growing everywhere, which isn't reality. Honestly, if we were to speak about, say, non-agricultural opportunities in rural India, for example, sericulture, etc., are looked at as agricultural allied services or allied professions. What about non-agricultural incomes? What about non-agricultural work opportunities for citizens of rural India?
The larger non-agricultural opportunities are necessarily urban, right? If you're going to build a large factory with a large number of employees, they will require workers to come to that point. Now, there are states that have tried to therefore create dispersed urbanization, and some of it is inherent in a state like Tamil Nadu, where the local capital has gone first into educational institutions and then into industry, and the development of local capital goes back several decades. So in that place, that kind of a region, what you get is people continuing to stay in the village, but going down to nearby towns for non-agricultural work. Now, this commuting system works very well because you can continue to retain the residential infrastructure of the village while you work with the urban infrastructure of the town where the factory or other sort of work opportunities are located. Now, this process doesn't work everywhere else. Now, in a state like Karnataka or even in Telangana, you have a single city kind of urbanization, that the entire activity is towards a single city. So people then have to travel much greater distances to come to the city, combined with the fact that your urban strategy is based upon substantially increasing the cost of living in the city. There's very little sense of the cost of living for the poor. There's no housing for the poor. In fact, if you look at the difference between the initial efforts made during the early years of independence or even pre-independence, Jamshedpur and places like that, you didn't think of a major industry without recognizing the role of housing within that. Whereas post-91, like if you build the electronic city, you think only of the firms, places for the firms. There's no thought of the housing. So when that happens, you create a lot of urban chaos and you raise the cost of living because people have to now commute great distances from the heart of the city to electronic city or to other peripheries of the city. And once those costs of living increase, you tend to then invest in infrastructure to make commuting easier, but that further increases the cost and that will be passed on to the poor. It can be passed on directly by fees, saying like the toll gate, or it gets passed on indirectly, like if the government decides to make that expenditure on its own, it is simultaneously separating it or sort of diverting those resources away from assets like housing that could have been given to the poor. So this process is becoming a critical problem in India to the extent that some of these industries that are alternative industries to agriculturists have now started moving out. In the 70s, particularly and then the 80s and the 90s, the garment industry was very big in Bangalore. It made use of workers who had come in from rural area about a radius of 250 kilometers. But as the cost of the city began to increase, it could no longer compete with Chittagong. Right? So it lost many of these industries here had to close down to a point that where some industries that had started in Bangalore by Bangaloreans were now moved to Chittagong themselves. So you're really in a situation where the urban is not playing the role of supporting the rural, of trying to absorb the labor that's released from agriculture.
So this is more of my observation than a question. Over the years, whenever I've traveled by cab, the driver is somehow inadvertently a farmer, a land-owning farmer who's left his father, a couple of brothers back in his village, but has migrated to the city to earn a living that is a non-agricultural form of income. They've chosen to be here. They can speak about politics, they can speak about agriculture, they can speak about how challenging it is to continue in agriculture as an entire family. Agricultural lands that were being tilled, the work that was taking place in farms as a family unit have kind of broken down into segments where at least one son, a couple of sons are in the city looking for income elsewhere. Now, these are land-owning farmers and land-owning farming families. There are also the other strata of farm laborers turned urban laborers in cities like Bangalore too. Now, these people only come to the cities to work in an off season, in a post-harvest season when they have no other work. But even the work that they get in the city they continue to work as laborers, they register themselves as construction workers, they go back to the villages during harvest time once again. So there is a clear distinction even within migrating farmers or farm laborers, even when they arrive in the city. Opportunities are not the same.
I think it's important to recognize that there are 4 types of responses to the agrarian crisis. The first is to stay on in the village and work in nearby urban centers. This is particularly true of areas where you have for families that are successful in agriculture and can educate the next generation who are able to tap these opportunities. The second is in many ways the most painful for women, and this is where there is no nearby option, so you have to sort of migrate long distances. And in that process of migration, the man typically goes out first. And if there is very limited success, the cost of living in the city does not allow him to bring the wife and the family with him. So the wife is left behind. And in those situations, there are villages where women become the heads of households nominally, but they're just basically abandoned. And this, in some of the villages we have studied, can be up to 25% of the household. So that is a very serious kind of issue. The third element is where you try to move out of the village, but at short spurts, where you keep your family in the village, but you try and get out, you send out the young men. So what will happen, you get these groups of workers mobilized usually on caste lines from places like Bihar or Jharkhand, and who are entirely male. They come here and live in abysmal conditions, but send all their money back home. These were the workers, the migrant workers you saw that were affected by the pandemic. When the money goes back home, even if they have to get back home in a crisis, they have to wait for the money to come through informal channels from their village. And when they wait for it, their opportunities to get back, in the case of the pandemic, all disappear, leaving them in a complete crisis. The fourth response, and this is something that's often not adequately recognized, is when everything fails, you just go back to your village, because at least you have a shelter there. There are no rented houses in the village. Almost all houses are owned by the people who stay. It might be a thatched roof hut, but it's still their own. So you tend to go back home whenever there's a crisis. And if there happens to be an opportunity of, say, some farmer trying to expand activities to modernize, which you find in pockets, particularly in central Maharashtra, then you try and get you try and find agricultural work there, which incidentally is a women-led process. In fact, in our study of inequality, we found that this was the only form of transformation where men were willing to put domestic work as their secondary occupation. Where no other part of the country were they willing to do so.
We'll get back to our conversation with Narendar Pani and Anusha Ravi Sood after a short break. Dear listeners, if you have been listening to the BIC Talks podcast for some time now, you may know that we regularly collaborate with the Bangalore Literature Festival for live streams and podcasts. I'm pleased to share that a pandemic-friendly edition of the Bangalore Literature Festival is happening at the Bangalore International Centre in Domlur on December 12th and December 13th, 2020. It will be a hybrid festival featuring national and international authors coming in on video and Bangalore-based authors participating at the festival in person. You too can participate in person while following good mask hygiene and physical distancing, and can register in advance if you wish to do so. If you're not in Bangalore or prefer following the discussions remotely, I'm happy to share that all events will be live streamed. Visit bangaloreliteratureFestival.org, sign up and attend the festival exactly as you would like to. With that, let's get back to the conversation between Narendar Pani and Anusha Ravi Sood.
The only thing probably worse than the abysmal conditions in which our farmers and farm laborers live in the cities is back home when they decide that there's no other option and surrender to suicides. It's a very controversial topic. A lot of people are very critical of farmer suicides and how they are treated in India. There are issues when it comes to the government even recognizing a farmer surrendering to suicide as an indication of a farm crisis. There are attempts to bury it as a result of a personal problem, etc. We look at so many cases on an annual basis in arid regions of Vidarbha, whether it is in Karnataka, huge parts of Marathwada. Why is this such a touchy topic for us to discuss? We hear about it, but given the kind of numbers we see every year, it looks like we're pretty much doing nothing about it.
No, I think the important thing to recognize here, and which I think we all tend to ignore, is what is the pattern of these suicides? Where are they occurring? And the most striking aspect is they are not occurring in the poorest regions. Most suicides are not there in Bihar or Jharkhand or places like that, where they are all concentrated in areas where there is growth. Even within Karnataka, the suicides are more in Mandya than they are in Kolar, in the irrigated belt rather than the unirrigated belt. This is important to note because basically our study found that there were two types of conditions that led to suicide. One was the kind of conditions which has made Maharashtra the second largest state in terms of the rates of suicide. And this is that you have some successful farmers who are able to respond to the crisis by expanding agriculture. And then the smaller farmers are pushed into agricultural labor, working on the farms that have been expanded. The ones in the middle belonged in the past to the same class as the new large farmers, and they try to a foothold there by borrowing heavily. And when that fails, they are left with no option in their mind to protect their status and that of their family, other than to commit suicide. On the other hand, if you go to a state like Kerala, which incidentally is the state with the highest suicide rate, you will find that essentially people have managed to move out of agriculture quite substantially, largely because their villages have themselves, with the help of remittances from the Gulf, become small towns. So you have that kind of process occurring, but for agricultural labor, particularly those above 50, they don't have the option of moving into, say, the construction sector. People above 50 cannot work in the kind of safety norms followed in Indian construction. So they end up staying back in the village, but they have to try and get the next generation to move out of agriculture. It's easier for them to do it with the young men. But with the young women, the only thing they can do, because urban India employs, contrary to popular notions, employs the women at a lower rate than agriculture did. So you end up in a process where you try to get them married into non-agricultural families, who in turn demand huge dowries. So you have to borrow. You sometimes, in Kerala, you invest in your own houses to try and create an impression of being richer than you are in order to get your daughter married. And that repaying those loans then becomes a matter of great pressure, often leading to suicides among agricultural labor who are above 50.
I have to speak about the plight of the forgotten women farmers when it comes to farmer suicides in India. First of all, getting the government to recognize a farmer's suicide as a result of an agrarian crisis is difficult. It is even more so in the case of women farmers. For example, in Karnataka, a few numbers that are put at, I think about 18 to 23% of farmer suicides in Karnataka are of women farmers. However, they're never acknowledged. They're never seen as a result of a farm crisis. I need to understand this phenomenon. Like you said, women are employed in agriculture, probably much more in number than in non-agricultural professions. But why is there this reluctance to include women farmer suicides also as a worrying trend?
I'm not sure. In fact, I think treating it as women's farmer suicides underestimates the problem. You see, look at it like this. You have pressure on the family. They have to take care of whatever commitments, etc. And there are 2 points where that pressure plays itself out. One is at the head of the family, which is what we are recognizing normally as farmer suicides. The other is on the daughter-in-law. You see, if there is a pressure on the family for resources, you try to get it from your daughter-in-law first through extended dowries and other such processes. Yeah? And that the main connection with the farmers' crisis really is, I would say, in rural housewife suicides. We don't have the numbers because the housewife suicides is given as a cumulative number. You don't get the urban-rural difference. But the fact is that whatever we have seen, the housewife suicide rate is in fact higher or on par with the farmer's suicide rate. And that is linked to the same process. Some of them might be registered as farmers, some of them may not be registered as farmers. But the fact is that essentially the two suicide crises are linked. And it would be, in fact, underestimating the pressure on women and the tendency to commit suicide if we just see it in terms of those who are working in farms. Even those who are not working in farms may be put under tremendous pressure to get the resources for their newly acquired families. And when they cannot do that, and they cannot go back home because their parental family may not be better off in any case, they are also sort of forced into thinking of committing suicide. I think it's a larger crisis of suicides in India. You must remember that India has also got one of the higher rates of suicides as a whole in the world.
Professor Pani, I want to revisit the topic you raised a couple of minutes ago about how the workers we saw traveling on foot, hoping to go back to their villages, were probably marginal agricultural laborers who come to the cities to earn a living for their families, young men who leave their families back in their village to try to help them in the rural crisis that they live in. So, talking about the conditions of, say, marginal farmers, marginal workers, they already have it tougher than land-owning farmers. The challenge becomes more so when the urban India is not conducive for their work, isn't it?
Yes, I think we must make one more distinction here, because the ones who are really deprived, who face absolute deprivation in the villages, don't have the resources to migrate to Bangalore, even for the short term. Right? So if you look at the really backward areas, Bihar, Jharkhand, areas like that, you will find that the ones who are migrating are actually the middle level. Right? It's the middle caste. In fact, I don't want to get into politics of it, but these are the people who have been mobilized by Nitish Kumar in the past. And therefore, when you had the migrant crisis, he was the worst hit by it. But that's an aside. But the point is that you have a basic process whereby the ones who migrate need migration capital, and the amount of migration capital required varies by distance. So if I'm nearby and I can get back to my village in a crisis, I require relatively low levels of migration capital, so I can be among the poorest and still try and tap into that. But if I'm going to come from, say, Bihar to Bangalore, a distance of 1,500 kilometers or so, then I cannot function with low levels of capital. I normally try and pool together, form an identity group, a caste group, and come as a group. But still, typically they belong to the middle caste. And these are the people who come in. So that distinction, if we recognize, you'll see that they can then try and use their basic strategies to try and earn in the cities and spend in the villages. Because the village, they meet lower costs, particularly in housing, but they can earn much higher nominal wages in the cities. So when they do that, they go back and sometimes challenge the current hierarchy in the village. In fact, there was a village that one of my colleagues studied. And in that village, there was, after a while, the group of migrants went back, and then headed by a taxi driver in Delhi. This was a village in Bihar. And they went back and the taxi driver won the Gram Panchayat election. So that process is different. But there is a general decline in the rural areas, and all benefits and costs are relative. So what they get in the city might be very small. But compared to what people are earning in the village, it makes them relatively more powerful. So it has its own dynamics and politics that goes with it.
In one of my conversations with the editor of Slum Jagattu in Bangalore, Isaac Arul Selva, he mentioned about how the people you see in shanties, people dwelling under flyovers in cities like Bangalore, people dwelling in slums for years together, were all probably once landowners, whether it was a small patch of land or huge pieces of land, most of them at least, who probably lost that land to infrastructure projects, whether it was highways, dams, whether it was any other kind of infrastructure projects. And the government, although offers alternate land, offers them displacement from their native places to elsewhere, they probably do not have the kind of returns or the kind of collective lived memories of that place. And hence it makes it easier for them to uproot themselves from their villages and come to cities looking for better opportunities. But are the cities ready for them? Say, if we look at a city like Bangalore, or we take a look at a city like Mumbai, rather, where we see huge population, huge number of people traveling, migrating, looking for opportunities. Are our cities and are our urban policy makers ready to welcome these people, or rather consider these people in the larger scheme of things when they sit down for policy making?
No, not at all. So what the farmers, I think it's a mistake to think that the ones you see in Bangalore are only those who have been displaced by government or by selling their land. A vast majority of them retain the land. In fact, that's one of the reasons why you have such high levels of fallow land in the rural areas, because that is a kind of a fallback, a kind of a safety net. In fact, most of the workers you see, construction otherwise, own some land back in their village. But it's as a kind of a safety net. Now, the issue really is that when they come here on a short-term basis. There's no way they cannot afford the rents, and there's no way they're going to sort of pull in and make any kind of permanent investment in agriculture because they don't identify with the city. I remember when we did a study of garment workers, and every one of them, even those who have been working here on and off for 29, 30 years, even they said that they will go back to the village once they cannot work anymore. There is a sense of identity with the village, which is why when something like COVID-19 strikes, you go home. Everyone goes home. And home for them remains in the village, irrespective of how long they've been in the city. So the issue is really, the fact that the cities cannot absorb them is obvious. You have something like, we are talking about 200 to 300 million people being released from agriculture, if not much higher numbers. And there's no way most of our cities can absorb them, particularly cities that don't build housing for the poor, like Bangalore. We used to at one time, but we no longer do. And that becomes a critical issue for these people. So the issue is that the temporariness has been built into the system ever since liberalization. Prior to that, you had a system of trying to disperse industries. So you had local centers where the workers could go to, either stay in the village and commute to it, or at least within the state, you try and migrate. It's like a worker from Raichur coming to Bangalore. They typically come with their families, work a few months, and then go back and leave, or sometimes leave their children with their grandparents. All these options are not available when you have to travel 1,500 kilometers.
Governments after governments interactions with have tried to retain agricultural laborers or agricultural workers or farmers in rural areas. Government after government have tried to stop migration to cities and to make agriculture or rural economy as a whole, even including non-agricultural options in rural India, more lucrative, more productive, and more outcomes. But there seems to be very little change on ground. For example, in Karnataka, the government tried to wean farmers away from commercial crops, or wean farmers away from sugarcane as a whole and encourage maize. For example, they've tried to set up small shops or outlets as franchises in rural areas to encourage rural youth to take up entrepreneurship over the years. All of these are measures to ensure that there is little or considerably lesser migration from villages to cities. But is there a need to relook at our rural policy as well? How do you ensure that people in villages have a better life, livelihood, and income without considering migrating? Is that even an option?
The basic mistake that is being made in that strategy is that if you put the government against the market wins. This is happening in international finance, where until the 1980s, it was thought that the government could step in and then protect their currency. Now they know they cannot. They no longer do it. They use other strategies to try and control the currency. This is happening in industry. That essentially the market is both completely decentralized in the sense that it's based on individual actions. At the same time, it is overwhelming. The effort of the government to challenge it, this is an old debate that should have gone away with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it hasn't. India is among the few countries that try to maintain it, and that is a thing that you're always going to to get over. The point is that you need market-related solutions. Now, that does not mean giving the market a free hand, which many in India seem to think is the way out. Because the moment you do that, you'll have the kind of situation you're talking about, say, in the farmers' crisis, where those who lose out to competition need to be taken care of. Now, Indian democracy has had one major and I think grossly underestimated success, and that is in ensuring that whatever happens to the market, however unfair the market is, the people can be protected from its worst effects. That you can call it subsidies, you can call it welfare, you can give it whatever name you like. But if you have not had large-scale starvation as a result of the movement from agriculture to industry, it is essentially because you have had systems to take care of the poorest. This, I think we lose the sense of the magnitude of this achievement because we ignore the fact that when you have other countries, large countries have moved from agriculture to industry or have tried to modernize their agriculture in any way, they've had huge social costs. You had millions, maybe 40 million lives lost in the Soviet Union when they went in for collectivization. The lives lost in the Industrial Revolution have not been counted. The lives lost in the wiping out of the American Native Indian is huge. Nobody is even looking at those factors. Now, if you have not fallen into the same trap, if you have not fallen into the same magnitude of disaster, it's only because of democracy and the politicians' recognition of the immediate need of paying out or protecting people from extreme disaster. And I think their history will finally, I think, at some point, be extremely grateful to the political class and what we dismiss as their welfarism.
Finally, I must ask this question, when migration from villages are discussed as a topic, I'll play the devil's advocate and say, why not? If a farmer or a farmer's children aspire to be city dwellers, aspire to migrate to cities because they consider living in cities is good for them, for their future, for their lives, then why not? Especially at a time when a lot of city dwellers are not willing to go back to agriculture or go back to non-agricultural opportunities in villages. Why should the burden of staying in villages and making rural economy tick be only on farmers?
Let's be clear about this, that essentially the development theory expects the entire economy to move from agriculture dependence to industry dependence. Now, the point is that if they are not able to come here, it's because you have the resources to make your cities welcoming. Right? Now, one way of generating those resources is to allow the cities to grow easily, the kind of process Tamil Nadu is going through, where the people continue to remain in the village but earn in nearby towns. And as those towns grow and their earnings increase, they have the capital to move permanently into urban centers. That's a smooth process, but it is confined to a very small part of India. Elsewhere, you're just throwing them to the processes of the urban market. And there, they cannot afford land, they cannot afford a house. And that is the kind of crisis in which you are placing them by just saying the markets will take care of everything. The markets won't. The markets are interested in commodities. Right? They are interested in ensuring that commodities are produced in the most efficient way possible. The people who are not efficient have to be left behind. But any development strategy, any humane view of India and its future would have to recognize that those who are left behind are also living people, living beings. You cannot just say that if they cannot succeed in the market, we don't care about what happens to them. That is the heart of the prize. They tend to go back to the villages because with all its internal differences and conflict that Ambedkar wrote so extensively about, they at least have a roof over their heads.
We should perhaps always remember that any impact, any disturbance in agricultural economy, rural economy will have a huge impact on the food we eat every day, whether it is staple or whether it is outing at a restaurant. The impact is pretty huge.
I would just add that that's a very important point to end, because if the system that is there in Punjab, Haryana and Western Uttar Pradesh is allowed to break down and procurement is heard, your public distribution system will collapse. And if that happens, you will have a serious problem for the urban middle class or certainly the lower middle class. And that's a certain issue that we are not talking enough about.
Thank you so much, Professor Pani. I think I'll hand it over to Pawan.
Thank you, Anusha.
Thank you, Anusha, and thank you, Dr. Pani, for this wonderful conversation. I can't wait to have it up on BIC Talks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website bangaloreinternationalcentre.org as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.